Welcome to Echoes of Eden, where we delve into timeless truths and share practical wisdom for navigating modern life. In today's episode, we explore a deeply resonant topic, marital responsibilities in Nigeria, a journey through culture and faith. Discover how cultural expectations and spiritual principles shape the foundations of marriage in Nigeria, offering insights that transcend borders and inspire meaningful connections. If this sparks your interest, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay connected with our thought-provoking content. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the discussion.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about something I know is important to all of us. Responsibilities in relationships.
Oh yeah, for sure.
But for this one, we're going to be looking at it from a slightly different perspective. Through a totally different culture, because our source material is actually a Nigerian relationship advice podcast.
Interesting.
Called Echoes of Eden.
Okay.
Hosted by Mr. Ed with relationship expert Mr. Blackie.
Gotcha.
And it's really fascinating stuff. So the question we're going to be looking at today is, where do these responsibilities in a relationship actually start and stop?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Because are we talking about set roles, or is there something more to it?
Right.
Especially, when we think about the clash between more traditional expectations and then, just modern life, what we're all dealing with today.
Yeah, and how that affects things, for sure.
So right off the bat, Mr. Blackie kind of throws down this gauntlet. He claims that responsibilities in a relationship don't actually have an endpoint. It's more about understanding your role.
Okay.
With a man as the leader and the woman as the support.
Okay.
But Mr. Ed, who's kind of playing the role of the skeptical listener, I guess,
yeah,
immediately kind of pushes back against this idea of fixed roles, especially in today's world.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. We're living in a time where women are contributing a lot more financially and men are taking on more of, the household duties and stuff like that.
Exactly. So then how does this very traditional division of labor really fit into this modern world?
Yeah, how does it?
And this is where it gets interesting, because then Mr. Blackie clarifies that while he believes in this sort of traditional framework, he sees the roles as being flexible.
Okay.
So, for example, he talks about a situation where if a woman's husband loses his job, she might step up financially, but the man will still maintain his leadership in other aspects of the relationship, like the decision-making or providing emotional support.
That's interesting. So it's kind of like this flexible role situation where it's not necessarily always a 50-50 split in every area of life, but it's more based on maybe strengths and stuff like that.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And it really throws a wrench in this, very traditional one-size-fits-all approach to relationships.
For sure.
But then Mr. Ed brings in another really interesting element to the conversation, which is burnout.
Oh, okay.
So he's talking about how many Nigerian women are juggling their jobs, childcare, all the household responsibilities, and then they feel like their husbands are relying on tradition to kind of avoid doing more.
Interesting.
And Mr. Blackie's reaction to this is explosive.
Oh, wow.
So it's like this big clash between traditional expectations and then just these modern pressures that everybody is facing.
Right. It's almost like they're butting heads a little bit.
They are. It's very raw and honest, and you can really feel the complexity of it.
Wow.
But he does make a good point. Mr. Blackie does say that we can't just paint all men with the same brush.
Right, of course.
And that a lot of men are actively participating. But then he admits that, some men do absolutely misuse tradition to get out of responsibility.
Okay, so he's kind of acknowledging both sides a little bit.
He is. And then what's really interesting is that he also says that sometimes women contribute to this dynamic by taking on too much, because they feel guilty or they need to prove themselves.
Oh, that's interesting. So he's kind of bringing up this idea of the mental load of everything that needs to get done.
Absolutely. And how this is often something that women are carrying. And they're constantly planning, organizing, and it's like this silent pressure that can lead to a lot of resentment and imbalance.
Right. Yeah, I can definitely see that.
And this brings us to what I think is the core question in this whole episode, which is, when do responsibilities stop being an act of love and start to feel like a burden or an obligation?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Yeah. And Mr. Blackie's answer to that is, it's all about the intention behind it. So when you're doing something for your partner out of love and care, it feels totally different than if you're doing it because you're obligated or forced to do it.
Right. It's almost like the difference between giving someone a gift freely and having to pay a debt.
Exactly. And then he gives these really relatable examples. So he talks about a wife who cooks every single meal out of obligation, not because she wants to or enjoys it or anything, or a husband who pays all the bills but then doesn't feel appreciated for it.
Oh, yeah. I can definitely see how both of those would lead to resentment pretty quickly.
Right. So even though the actions themselves might be beneficial to the relationship, when they lack that genuine love and appreciation, it just leads to problems.
For sure. So I guess the question then is, how do you make sure that those acts of service are really about love and not just like checking things off a to-do list?
Well, Mr. Blackie says it's about two things: communication and balance.
Okay.
So instead of, silently struggling with all these obligations, he says you need to openly communicate your needs and feelings to your partner.
That makes sense.
So he paints this picture of, a wife who is completely overwhelmed with work and the house and the kids. And instead of bottling it all up, she expresses to her husband that she needs help.
Okay.
And then her husband, responding out of love, not obligation, steps up and helps share the burden.
It sounds so simple, but it's huge. Just having that conversation can change the whole dynamic.
Absolutely. And what's even more interesting is that Mr. Blackie doesn't frame it as, whose job is this or anything. It's more about making life easier for each other as a team, working together.
Yeah. The teamwork, for sure.
Exactly. And it really makes you think, are we doing things out of obligation or are we doing it out of love?
That's a good question.
But then Mr. Ed brings in another really important point, which is the influence of culture.
Oh, right.
So he brings up the traditional expectations in Nigeria for men to be the providers and for women to submit to their husbands.
Right.
And the question is, how do you reconcile these very ingrained norms with how relationships are changing today?
Yeah, I'm really curious to hear what they have to say about that.
Me too. Well, Mr. Blackie actually acknowledges the importance of culture, but he says that you shouldn't rigidly cling to tradition, especially if it's hurting the marriage.
Okay.
He even goes so far as to say that if a man is solely responsible for the finances, even when he's struggling, that's not a partnership. It's a form of slavery.
Wow, that's a really strong statement. So he's really challenging these cultural norms that can sometimes lead to these really big imbalances in a relationship.
He is. And then he goes on to say that submission shouldn't mean blind obedience, especially if the husband's behaving irresponsibly or abusively.
Right.
He thinks that a wife should be able to correct her husband, obviously using wisdom and understanding.
Of course.
But for him, marriage is about teamwork and partnership, not dictatorship.
Yeah, I can see how that could be kind of a surprising perspective for some people.
Definitely. But it really speaks to this growing movement towards more equal and respectful relationships.
It does.
Where both partners have a voice and can really contribute their strengths.
Absolutely, and contribute to the relationship as a whole. So it sounds like he's really advocating for open communication and mutual respect in a marriage.
Absolutely. And to really see how this works in practice, Mr. Ed actually asks him to give some examples of how couples can, handle some real world issues.
Okay, yeah.
Things like financial stress disagreements with in-laws, even those tribal differences.
Right.
That can sometimes cause problems.
Yeah, definitely.
And Mr. Blackie throws out two scenarios that really show how important flexibility is.
Yeah.
And that whole idea of like, we're in this together,
Teamwork makes the dream work.
Exactly. So the first scenario he talks about is a husband loses his job.
Okay.
And instead of like falling into despair or blame, the wife actually takes the initiative to start her own business.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
But the key here is that the husband doesn't just like sit back and do nothing.
Right.
He actually steps up to support her in whatever way he can. Maybe helping with the kids or taking on some of the logistics of the business.
So he's still contributing to the family, even though he's not the one bringing in the money.
Exactly. It's about adapting to the situation and supporting each other no matter what.
I like that.
And his second scenario is just as interesting. He talks about a wife who's having issues with her in-laws.
Oh, yeah. That's a classic.
And instead of like leaving her to deal with it alone, the husband steps in, sets boundaries, and protects his wife.
So it's about recognizing your partner is struggling and doing something to help.
Exactly. And again, it's not about saying like, oh, well, traditionally that's the wife's job or anything.
Right. It's more about just being there for each other.
It's about recognizing your partner is hurting and doing whatever you can to ease that burden.
That makes a lot of sense.
And I think both of these scenarios really show how powerful a truly supportive partnership can be.
Yeah, I agree.
Even when you're dealing with these cultural expectations,
Right. It's not about erasing tradition, but finding ways to make it work for your relationship.
Exactly. And that brings us to Mr. Blackie's closing message,
Okay.
which I thought was super powerful. He really urges couples to step back and look at the big picture.
Okay.
He says that marriage isn't about keeping score or like sticking to these rigid roles.
Right.
It's about building a life together
Oh.
through all of the ups and downs, the challenges, the triumphs.
Yeah, you're a team going through life together.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he says that honesty, support, and most importantly, love
Yes.
should be the foundation of any marriage.
I love that.
That responsibilities are just a way to express that love.
Yeah, turning those feelings into actions.
And when I heard him say that, it really hit home for me,
Yeah, me too. It's like those everyday tasks, those responsibilities we sometimes complain about, they can actually be really meaningful.
Right. It's not just about like taking out the trash. It's about showing your partner you care.
Exactly. And this whole deep dive has been so interesting because it shows that there's no right answer when it comes to responsibility in a relationship.
Right. What works for one couple might not work for another.
Totally. And cultural norms, while important, they should always be looked at and adapted to fit each unique relationship.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So now we want to turn it over to you, the listener.
Yeah.
We've explored all these ideas about responsibility, inspired by that Nigerian podcast.
Right.
But now it's your turn to think about how this applies to your own life.
So how do you see this playing out in your relationship?
Because this deep dive has definitely got me thinking about my own partnership.
Oh, yeah, me too.
Like, are we balancing those obligations with genuine care, or have we kind of slipped into autopilot?
It's so easy to do that.
And that's why I love that Mr. Blackie really emphasized communication.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's not a one-time conversation,
Right. You have to keep checking in with each other.
because needs change, circumstances change. We have to be willing to adapt.
Exactly. And speaking of adaptation, do you remember those scenarios Mr. Blackie talked about?
Yeah.
The husband supporting the wife's business or protecting her from the in-laws.
Yeah.
It's not about saying, oh, well, that's traditionally the woman's job.
Right.
It's about saying, how can I best support my partner right now in this situation?
Your team, not competitors.
Exactly.
And that brings us to our final question for you to think about. Are you ready for it?
Hit me.
How can you and your partner ensure that responsibilities are shared in a way that feels loving and supportive and not burdensome or unfair?
Wow. That's a really good question.
It might not have an easy answer, but it's definitely worth exploring.
It is. It's about finding that balance where both partners feel valued and respected and supported.
And not just with words, but with action.
Yes, exactly.
It's about stepping up and saying, I've got you, even when it's not technically your job.
That's what makes a relationship strong.
And that's where the real magic has, right? When those everyday responsibilities become a way to show your love and commitment.
Yeah, not a source of conflict.
And Mr. Ed actually ends the Echoes of Eden episode on a similar note.
Really?
Reminding listeners that the best relationships aren't about perfect roles, but about love taking the lead.
I love that.
And I think that's something we can all relate to.
It's a universal message.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into responsibilities in relationships,
Yeah.
we want to thank Echoes of Eden for this incredible conversation.
It was really thought-provoking.
And to all of you listening out there,
Yeah.
keep those conversations going in your own relationships.
Keep talking.
Keep your hearts open and keep nurturing those bonds that bring you joy and support.
Absolutely.
Till next time, keep diving deep.